The conclusion that emerges is that the moon was constructed by these survivors of some kind of apocalypse on Mars, and it probably had at least two functions initially. One was to transport a shit ton of people over here, and the other one was to act as a terraforming device. There was this one case, and here we're going to get into a case of murder also.
Let's do it.
There was this one case of this, I think he was Sergeant. Yeah, Sergeant Carl Wolf, who, although he wasn't fairly high-ranking, I mean, you know, this is how compartmentalized information works in the military. You can be a relatively low-ranking person, but if you have technical expertise in a particular area, you have to be given a high-level security clearance because you need to work on some technical aspect of a very sensitive subject. So in the case of Carl Wolf, he was a photographic technician and repairman. And I think it was 1965, so a few years before we went to the moon, right? We've got the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter going around the moon preparing for the Apollo mission. And Carl Wolf is called in his capacity as a photo technician, photographic repairman. He's called into what they told him was an NSA facility. And I think he was stationed on Langley Air Force Base at the time. And they say, you know, we need you to come over to this NSA facility and work on this photographic processing machine. In 1965, nobody knew what the fuck the NSA was. It was so secret that people didn't even know it existed. So Wolf assumed that it was a NASA facility. He heard NSA as NASA.
Okay.
And it also makes sense in terms of what he saw when he got there, which is that when he walked into this place, first of all, he saw scientists from all around the world. And he could tell because they were of various ethnicities. He saw Japanese people, Indian people, people from multiple countries speaking multiple languages, European languages.
I'm sure there's a few Germans in there.
Probably more than a few. And so he's taken into the photo lab, right? And there's another guy in there who's the same rank as him, I think also a sergeant. And before he gets to work on repairing this machine, this sergeant, and the two of them are in there alone, right? This sergeant can't help himself, and he breaks protocol, and he shows Carl Wolf the photographs that have been coming off this machine he was brought in to repair. And they're mosaic photographs where, you know, the orbiter will take a bunch of images, a bunch of shots, and then they'll lay them next to each other and form a mosaic of a larger site that's been targeted for satellite photography, right? And the sergeant says, we found a city. And he starts showing him these mosaics, putting them next to each other. And they're high-resolution photographs of a megalithic city on the dark side of the moon. Spherical buildings, polygonal buildings, obelisks like the, you know, needles in Egypt, and dishes, he said, like that looked like, you know, radio telescope dishes. Huge structures, which I guess the resolution of the photographs was so good that he could tell that they weren't made of metal. They were made of something like a poured stone, kind of like concrete, which is interesting because a lot of ancient sites on Earth are made from that type of material, right? These enigmatic megalithic structures on Earth seem to have a similar construction as what Carl Wolf, at least what was you know, presented to him as a city on the dark side of the moon. And so he's looking at this thing, and somebody walked in, and so the sergeant cuts off his illegally volunteering this classified information to Wolf, and he goes to work repairing the photography machine. But anyway, he said he went home and he expected that either that night or like sometime in the next week or sometime in the next year, we would hear about this city that had been photographed on the dark side of the moon. And of course, it was never revealed, right? So this was one of the most striking early testimonies that I heard from out of Greer's Disclosure Project that got me really interested in the moon. And what's really creepy is
that was 60 what?
65.
65.
A few years before Apollo. And what's really disturbing is that this disclosure wave that we're in the midst of right now began in 2017, right, with that New York Times piece.
Right.
So around about 2018, there are serious discussions about subpoenaing people to get testimony from them. And then later than that, Grush now, spearheaded this initiative to have people come and testify in front of Congress and release individuals from their security oaths, right? Well, guess when poor Carl Wolf met with an untimely end? 2018, 1 year after disclosure starts, his bike was run over by a truck.
How old was he?
Young, relatively.
Can you find the story of Carl Wolf?
He might have been in his 50s or something.
Wow.
And this is what happened to John Mack too. This is how they murdered John Mack. They had him run over on the road.
Yeah, but isn't it? Yeah, I understand that that's sketchy about John Mack, but do you think it's probable that he was whacked?
70.
And it wasn't just an accident.
100%. No,
Really?
Yeah, I do think so.
He was 74 years old.
The 74-year-old.
Yep.
Well,
Lansing
he was in good
bicyclist.
enough shape that he was riding his bike regularly.
Can you click on it? Oop. Page not found.
Just search Carl
Interesting.
Wolf with a K.
Oh, it's not this one?
No, well, it has a correct underneath there.
Yeah.
Oh, Carl, I see.
Carl Wolf with a K.
Claimed to have top secret NASA photos showing alien structures on the moon. He worked with a Tactical Air Command at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia and had top secret clearance in 2001. Wolf made a startling claim that NASA was hiding evidence of artificial structures on the far side of the moon. He died in a bike accident on October 10th, 2018 in New York after being hit by a tractor trailer.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So I think it's awfully convenient that just when people are going to be subpoenaed to testify under oath and released from their security clearances, this guy has an accident. Okay. So let's go further down this path to the moon.
Quick question. I don't want to derail this.
Yeah, go ahead.
But have you ever heard of a guy named Hal Povenmire? Okay. Continue.
Okay. So they had these photographs, right? Those photographs went somewhere. There was a whole room full of international scientists that Carl Wolf ran into on his way to repair that machine. So these photographs went somewhere. Well, guess what? These photographs show up again later in the history of military intelligence. In the 1970s, when Ingo Swan started to work for the Stanford Research Institute on contract for the CIA, some guy who identified himself as Lambert Dolphin, which is probably a pseudonym or code name. This Lambert Dolphin basically, he pulled Ingo Swan from out of the unit that he was working with. This unit that was basically a CIA unit, right?
Yep.
So this Lambert Dolphin, whoever he was, and Swan was never able to figure out what outfit in the U.S. government this guy was really working for. He had the authority to take a CIA asset out of the CIA remote viewing program and put him on another task. And Swan was blindfolded. He was flown in a helicopter to a classified facility. It was one of these deep underground facilities. And he recounts having gone down in an elevator, like Lord knows how deep. This is in Swan's book, Penetration. So Swan says he goes down there and they want his, talent as a remote viewer, and they start targeting him, on these photographs that are inside envelopes. And he basically starts describing the moon. But he's standing in the middle of a nexus of roads inside a city on the moon. And he describes these gargantuan buildings, huge, titanic scale of construction. He sees the same obelisks that Carl Wolf describes, like the needles in ancient Egypt. And he said, by the way, I got the impression that those were purely ceremonial. They didn't have any particular function. But he saw other buildings that looked like reactor domes, like as if they were, nuclear power plants or something like that, and receiving dishes and antennas and so forth. So he describes this Titanic city. And, it stands to reason that whatever was in those envelopes were probably the photographs that were taken by the orbiter back in 65 before Apollo, the photographs that Carl Wolf had reported seeing while he was repairing that machine.
Wow.
So now you have a second point of confirmation. Now here's the really creepy thing, Danny. What else Ingo Swan saw on the dark side of the moon were masses of people huddled together in ramshackle shelters. People who were naked and who were being used as slave labor. This is what he said. He said that. And now the fact that they were naked and apparently breathing while working inside craters on the moon, who knows, maybe mining helium-3 or whatever, suggests that there was some kind of an artificial atmosphere, that maybe where they were working was underneath a transparent dome that wasn't, visible to Swan.
Sure.
But in any case, that's not the important point. The important point, and the disturbing one, is that he saw slave labor on the moon, and the people who were directing it were these tall Nordic-looking fellows, one of whom could see Swan. And this has been reported by other remote viewers, where sometimes when they're sent to a target, whether it's a contemporaneous target or whether it's some event in the past, they're witnessed by whoever's there,
right,
as if like they're a ghost, and those people are seeing a ghost.
Yeah.
Well, this Nordic on the dark side of the moon saw Swan, and he got the distinct impression like the guy was telling him telepathically, why the fuck are you here? You don't belong here.
Right.
Get out of here.
Interesting.
Okay? Now that fits with something else that I was told. I was told this by an officer in the CIA who had read my book, Closer Encounters, and he wanted to have a conversation with me because he told me that basically...
When was this?
This was in... 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago.
This is his college. He's like, yo, I work for the CIA. Can we talk?
He knew someone I know.
Oh, okay.
And he got in touch through that person. And anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but long story short, he was like, how did you put all these jigsaw puzzle pieces together? He was looking to see if there was a leak and whether it needed to be plugged. Because he said that there were too many things in my book that were the same conclusions that they had reached, based on having access to classified information. And he was wondering how the hell I put these same pieces together in the same way.
About this moon stuff?
All kinds of things.
Okay.
The subjects that I discuss in this book, Closer Encounters.
Yeah. Okay.
And, but the moon came up, among other things. And he said, listen, after Swan was sent, we kept sending people to the moon, remote viewers. And we distinctly got the message from these guys on the moon, do not keep sending people here. This is off limits. And we didn't listen to them. And the last viewer that we sent up there, his soul is trapped on the moon. His body is in a coma in a special medical facility run by the CIA. And his family has been given like medical compensation or whatever. They told him, they told his family that the guy had died in the line of duty or whatever. And he's been held in stasis for years and years as they wait for his soul to come back from the moon, where apparently there's the capacity to lure and trap somebody's consciousness, which they finally did to one of these CIA remote viewers after repeatedly telling them not to surveil whatever's going on up there.
Strange. We had a guy on here named David Morehouse.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he was a remote viewer, he was a part of these programs for a long time. I think it was in the 70s.
I read his book Psychic Warrior. Early on.
Yeah. And he said that he remote viewed the moon and there was nothing. He's like, it's all bullshit. There's nobody there.
I don't know whether he was being blocked or what, but I can tell you some other things about the moon that are much creepier than a city on the dark side of it.
Well, and here's another thing. If there was a city, why is it only on the dark side?
Well, because that side faces away from us all the time.
So because whoever built it doesn't want us to see it?
Of course. Of course. That's the convenient place to put it. There's also another reason that's technical, which is that if you put, we've been studying this in terms of potential lunar colonization, that if you put listening telescopes, like the Arecibo dish, stuff that's meant to convey signals across space. If you put it on the side of the moon that faces the Earth, there's too much interference with radio signals coming from the Earth. So if you want to have basically interspace communication from the moon to elsewhere, it's better to put something on the side that always faces away from us, so that you're not bombarded with radio signals that are being transmitted from the Earth.
Right.
That's a technical reason why you would do it. But mainly, I think it's, for concealment purposes. Okay, but the story of what's going on the moon is a lot more. It's a lot more startling than finding a city on the dark side of it, right? Because you could be dealing with a natural satellite that has been colonized at who knows what time by whatever spacefaring civilization. No, it looks like there's a much more disturbing scenario here, and our government became aware of this during Apollo 12 and 13. During Apollo 12, I think it was the lander that impacted the moon in a way that set off a seismometer that had been pre-positioned there. There was a seismograph that was pre-positioned on the moon. And when the Apollo 12 lander hit the surface of the moon, the signal that came from this seismograph was consistent with the ringing or vibration of a hollow object.
Right.
So the way that the shock wave passed through the moon suggested that there was very little inside the moon.
Right.
Okay? It rang like a bell, as they described it.
For a while, right?
In the first case, it was for almost an hour. Mm-hmm. So then they got curious about this. And in Apollo 13, they deliberately crashed the third stage of Apollo 13 into the surface of the moon to carry out a test to see whether this was a repeatable phenomenon, right? And this time, the seismograph not only confirmed the resonance passing through a hollow object, but the moon rang like a bell for 3 hours. So, and they were able to tell like how much more or less of the moon, is apparently hollow.
Right.
And it's really shocking. It's like the moon goes down for about 20 miles as a solid structure. And then on the inside, there's a distance of about 1,000 miles radially, 1,000 miles from the interior of the shell to the core, radially in every direction. In other words, the distance between Los Angeles and Seattle, or New York and St. Louis, or Paris and Prague, out from the center is hollow inside the moon.
There was a recent NASA article that came out, I think it was on the NASA website, where they said they discovered caves, like underground caverns in the moon, which would suggest that it was like maybe like a honeycomb structure on the inside or something like that.
I suspect that it's not natural caverns, but that what they're seeing are the hollows between all kinds of complex machinery that are inside that structure. One of the other things that they noted with these impact tests was that the moon it seemed to compensate and correct for the impact in a way that suggested there were oscillators inside the structure.
Right.
So I think probably there's machinery inside this thing. Now, another data point that corroborates that, going back to the remote viewers,
sure,
is that Joe McMoneagle was tasked with remote viewing Mars in 1984. And this was a CIA operation run at the Monroe Institute. So it was CIA. He was working on contract for the CIA, and this was done at the Monroe Institute.
He was the first remote viewer, right?
I think he might have been. Well, no, I think Ingo Swan was the first remote viewer. Okay. But I think he had the designation 001 or something like that.
Yeah, one. Maybe it was 2. I don't know.
Yeah. But in any case, in 1984, Monroe Institute, and this has since been released. This is one of these classified documents that has since been declassified. It's called like Mars 1 million BC. You can look it up, Joe McMoneagle.
Mars 1 million BC.
Yeah, Joe McMoneagle. And so, look, Joe McMoneagle is tasked to look at. He doesn't know, of course. He's working blind to the target. That's how remote viewing is, right? But what's inside these envelopes are the photographs that the Viking probe took on Mars in 1976, where we got back these images of the pyramids and the fort and the face, infamously, right? So there are all these apparent man-made megalithic structures in the Cydonia region of Mars, which were first photographed by the Viking mission in 1976. And that's what was inside these envelopes when McMoneagle was doing this remote viewing session. And he described being in the midst of the ruins of a megalithic city with gigantic pyramids. He said they seemed like they were maybe 3 times the size of the Great Pyramid in Giza.
Wow.
And he described...
part of the Stargate project.
Yeah, he described a maze of structures under these pyramids, like subterranean tunnels and hallways. Mm-hmm. At one point, he walks through one of these hallways, and it leads to an opening, and he finds himself on the outside of the pyramid looking up at it, looking up across the face of the pyramid. And he describes also these highways that are trenches. They're these perfectly geometric trenches cut across miles and miles of Mars' surface. And he said his impression was that they were used for a craft. Like, you know, there are bad storms on Mars, right? So if you had hover cars or whatever, you would want them to be transiting through something that had high walls on either side. That was a, sunken channel, basically.
To avoid a sandstorm.
To avoid a sandstorm passing over the top of your head.
Yeah, like some Star Wars
So
shit.
this is basically, he describes this, okay, during his remote viewing session.
Yeah.
But he says, look, the civilization is long dead. I'm seeing, the ruins of a civilization that once was eons before this. And he was tasked at 1 million BC. So they said to him, okay, so go back to when these people were still alive and thriving. And he goes way, way back. Now, we can infer from another data point that I'll come to, how far back he went.
Okay.
But he doesn't say in the session. But he goes back to when these people were around. And then he describes Nordic-looking, super tall people in skin-tight jumpsuits. People who look like Scandinavians, except he said they had more like like between an Olympic swimmer and a football player's physique with very broad shoulders, not an ounce of body fat. He said he could see all their musculature through their skin-tight suits. And what McMoneagle relates is that these people were facing the end of their civilization. And some of them had this, what he describes as very philosophical sense of resignation, where they were like, well, we had our time. It's not fair for us to ask for more time. We've had more time than we should have had, some of them. And some of them are still trying to survive and endure. And the ones who are trying to survive, he says, they've looked for a way out. And no matter what they do, they can't seem to find a way out. So just pin that somewhere, right? Then he says they designed and got into a spacecraft that was cylindrical, and which is very much the description of a lot of these cylinder-shaped, cigar-shaped UFOs, metallic cigar-shaped craft. And they went to another planet, which they were scouting out to see whether it was a viable world for them to relocate to. And this other planet was nothing like Mars. It was very green, overgrown with vegetation, in fact. But there were constant storms on it, electrical storms, typhoons. There was a lot of volcanic activity on this planet. And they basically concluded that they couldn't settle there without altering the planet, without terraforming it in some way to make it more habitable. So
this is a long conversation to have during a remote viewing session.
Yeah, so they got all this out of him, right? I think those are all the important points. And
very detailed.
Yes. So now you put this next to what Dr. John Brandenburg discovered regarding Mars. Dr. Brandenburg, who I got to spend a few days with in New Mexico a number of years ago, he worked on the Clementine mission for NASA. And at one point, he was working at Sandia Labs, which is where I think a lot of the nuclear weapons are designed. And he was looking at isotopic data from Mars. So, every planet has, certain amount of isotopes of different materials and metals and so forth on it.
Right.
And apparently the isotopic ratio of xenon-129 is consistent across the entire solar system, except for on Mars and our thermonuclear test sites on Earth. There's a deviation from the norm of the isotopic signature of xenon-129 at our thermonuclear test sites on Earth. And we find the same thing at Cydonia on Mars.
Why is it different on nuclear test sites?
There's something happens when, and it has to be not an atomic bomb, but a thermonuclear bomb. When a thermonuclear bomb is detonated, that leaves a trace of xenon-129 in that area, which is not the normal, basically, distribution of that isotope that you would find, on Earth or on any of the other rocky bodies in the solar system.
Okay.
And according to Brandenburg, it's a very distinct signature. It's unmistakable, and it's very specifically associated with thermonuclear weapons detonation. Then, after he discussed this with one of the scientists at Sandia Labs, whose expertise is working on nuclear weapons, he checked for other isotopes, and he saw that the isotopes of the isotopic ratio of thorium and uranium was also off at Cydonia in a way that matched thermonuclear test sites. And so he came to the conclusion that, and even did the math, like how many nukes would you have had to detonate in this place to produce this kind of a deviation? Turns out that an Empire State Building's worth of our highest yield thermonuclear warheads would have had to have been detonated there to produce this kind of isotopic signature. And this is exactly the same place where we find these blasted megalithic structures on the surface of Mars.
So there's a nuclear war on Mars.
So Brandenburg's thesis is that there was a nuclear war on Mars. I cover this in my book, Closer Encounters.
And did that basically get rid of the atmosphere? Is that responsible for how the atmosphere is almost non-existent on Mars?
It would definitely have been a contributing factor. I want to come around to what I think might have been another factor in that. Okay. But definitely would have been a contributing factor. But we were on about the moon. So why am I going on this detour to Mars?
Yeah.
Because it's when you put Brandenburg's research next to what Joe McMoneagle saw. Mm-hmm. And by the way, while we're on this subject, Ingo Swan was also tasked independently of Joe McMoneagle to look at Mars twice. Once was in 1976, I think, and the other was in 1984, same year that McMoneagle did his, but Swan's team and McMoneagle were unaware of each other. These were, obviously this makes sense as protocol. They wanted two sets of remote viewers on the same target to get, corroboration. And Swan did his with a whole team of people. McMoneagle worked alone at the Monroe Institute. Swan had 5 or 6 people working with him. And in 1984, and also in the viewing in I think 76 or so, Ingo Swan and his team described exactly the same thing as Joe McMoneagle. They described a civilization on Mars, most of which was in ruins and was vastly ancient, but other parts of which still survived under the surface. He described a honeycomb of cities under the surface of Mars, and some structures on the surface, which were relaying information and being used as transportation beacons, and had been built by this civilization that is still active under the surface of Mars, cities that are subterranean. But this all came from out of discussing the moon. Mm-hmm. When you put the remote viewing data next to Brandenburg's thesis, what it suggests, and Brandenburg, his estimation was that this nuclear event in Cydonia took place maybe 100 million years ago. Maybe 100 million years ago.
Jesus.
When were the dinosaurs killed off?
6 million?
65 million years ago, right? So it's a ballpark. And when you put these two sets of data together, as I did in my book, Closer Encounters, the conclusion that emerges is that the moon was constructed by these survivors of some kind of apocalypse on Mars. And it probably had at least two functions initially. One was to transport a shit ton of people over here.
The moon?
And the other one was to act as a terraforming device. So if we didn't have the moon where it is, in this extremely stable orbit that it's in, right?
Yes.
We would have 8-hour days. The Earth would be spinning much faster than it is right now. The Earth would also not be as stable as it is. There have been calculations done that show that the Earth would be prone to toppling over at odd intervals.
Well, all planets have moons, right?
Yes, but only our moon stabilizes a planet to the extent, only our moon stabilizes our planet in the way that it does, and only our moon has as stable an orbit as it does. And none of the other moons in the solar system create the beautiful eclipses that we have here, because the moon is, get this, 1/400th the size of the sun.
Yep.
And it's 1/400th the distance to the sun. So the fact that it's 1/400th the size of the sun and 1/400th distance to the sun produces this perfect eclipse.
If you put the moon directly between us and the sun, it perfectly occludes the diameter of the sun.
Exactly.
Wait, do we know if there's any other moons
No, there's
like
no
that?
other moon that
There's
produces
no other
it.
moons
None.
like that.
But what's even more significant is that our moon has an extremely stable orbit. No other moon in the solar system orbits its planet with as little deviation as our moon does. Yes. And so it appears there's something inside the moon stabilizing that orbit, which is also stabilizing the Earth. And what did it give us? It gave us a climate, an environment, a biosphere that rendered this planet habitable for humans. Remember what McMonagall said. He said they sent a scout ship to another planet. It was overgrown with vegetation. It wasn't arid like Mars. There were volcanoes going off. There were electrical storms. And they were like, this place is too volatile. We can't settle here the way that it is now. So the moon was probably used in order to terraform the Earth into a habitat that Martians could settle in to become the human race. So now, there are other pieces of data. That
We're talking about roughly how long ago? 100 million?
100 to 65 million years ago. Now look, the dinosaurs would probably have had to have been killed off for this, right? So one, hypothesis that follows from this is that the impact that killed off the dinosaurs was deliberate, not, some accidental asteroid impact. It wouldn't have been very easy to coexist with them, right?
Right.
Okay, but look, there are other data points that really nail this case. Mm-hmm. For example, the craters on the moon. Mm-hmm. On Earth, when you have impact craters from meteorites, for example, right? The craters are roughly proportionally deep as they are wide. They dig into the Earth. On the moon, you have these utterly bizarre craters, which are like over 100 miles wide, like the Gagarin crater or the Clavius crater. You could fit Switzerland and Luxembourg together inside some of these craters. They're over 100 miles wide. They're never more than 4 or 5 miles deep. That doesn't make any sense. The inside of these crater basins are all convex, like the surface of a contact lens.
Right.
So think about this. Why would a meteorite impact produce a crater that's so much wider than it is deep, and then in the especially wide craters like Clavius, you see that the surface of that crater is convex? It's because it's hitting a hard shell that's underneath the regolith, and the regolith is like astroturf that's been put on the surface of that space station to make it look like it's a moon.
Holy shit. So they knew the Earth was there. It was too volatile, too unstable. I'm sure the equinox is not as stable as it is now.
There wasn't any. We didn't have seasons. That's a product of the moon. The equinoxes
is only because of the moon.
So this 23-degree deviation that we have between our equator and the celestial equator,
right,
that produces the equinoxes and the solstices, is a function of the moon.
What other things about the moon, other than we mentioned the distance from the sun to the moon and how it perfectly occludes the sun from our perspective, but what other things about our moon are exclusive to our moon.
So, first of all, there's the extremely bizarre ratio that you just mentioned, right? Where this 1/400th size of the sun, 1/400th distance from the sun.
Yep.
And that's what produces these eclipses. Then there's an incredible stability of the orbit of the moon.
Okay.
Then, as we mentioned, these craters don't make any sense, right? These craters don't make any sense. And the basin of them seems like it's revealing a shell of some kind, a spherical shell.
Yep.
Then there's the impact tests, right? The Apollo 12 and Apollo 13, where the moon on a seismograph registered like a hollow object.
Right.
And by the way, there's no moon that's a hollow object. Back before Carl Sagan became such a skeptic, he even commented on this and said that it's terrifying because no natural satellite is hollow. Back then,
we know that no other moons are hollow?
Yes, we know it.
How do we know?
It's just not what moons are. Moons are like, they're like rocky bodies that are trapped by a planet, and they're rocky all the way through.
And do we observe the craters on other moons to see how similar they are to our moon or how different they are than our moon?
Yeah. We have detailed, like, for example, Phobos and Erebus, the moons of Mars. We have detailed images of them. And first
how
of all,
many moons does Mars have?
It has 2.
2 moons.
Saturn and Jupiter have a bunch.
Right.
And, the other thing about these moons are they're all weird shaped. They look like deformed potatoes, a lot of them. They're not beautiful spherical objects like ours is. But there is another interesting thing, and that's the mass cons. So there are these, the moon has a lower gravity than Earth generally, right? Remember the golf ball thing?
Yep.
So, and the Apollo astronauts,
we'll
get to them too, the Apollo astronauts, hopping around, in the lower. But there are places on the moon where there's a much stronger gravity. There's Earth-like gravity or stronger than Earth-like gravity. And it's actually a problem for navigation because when they pass satellites over, they can't fly too low because the craft will be pulled by these gravity wells. There are places on the moon, they call them mass concentrations, where the gravity deviates from the standard on the moon.
Wow.
And guess what? They're all perfectly circular. So one thing I hypothesized in Closer Encounters was that if this thing is a space station, it's possible that they built saucers into the surface of it.
Look at that. Mascons, short for mass concentrations.
Yeah.
They're regions of the moon's surface with a higher gravitational pull than the surrounding areas. These anomalies were first identified in the 1960s. Holy shit.
Yeah, they have to compensate for those when they fly anything around the moon. Anyway, look, here's the thing.
We got to make sure we got to keep you on point here.
Yeah. So,
we can't be just letting Jorjani fly by the seat of his pants.
One possibility is that when they built the space station, they built saucers into the surface of it. Remember, all the mass cons are circular. A saucer is going to have a 0-point energy drive generating a
flying saucer?
Yeah, a flying saucer.
Okay.
Is going to have a local gravitational field.
Yeah.
And if there's people in the saucer, it's 1G.
Yes.
Which is greater gravity than the rest of the moon. So one possibility is that what these mass cons are saucers embedded in the space station underneath the regolith as a potential evacuation protocol. Suppose there's a danger, like if some giant asteroid is coming that might hit the Earth or it might hit the moon, and they need to evacuate this station, right? Well, these saucers could just peel off the surface. So that's one possibility of what these mass cons are. It are, saucers with 0-point energy drives running embedded into the surface of the object.
What do you make of the post-game press conference after the moon landing, where all the astronauts are sitting there? They look like they're on a hostage tape.
This is where I wanted to go next. We mentioned the astronaut, right? So, these guys don't even remember what they did up there. When you ask them, they've done interviews with these astronauts, and when you ask them, so what did you do on such and such a day? They basically rehearse a mission log. We did this, and then we went, no. I mean, how did you feel like when you were standing on the edge of that? And then they freeze up. They start to look ill. And so like you're saying in that press conference, right? They don't look like national heroes coming back from having been the first men on the moon.
Like hostages.
They look like they've had the shit scared out of them or, yeah. So I think that these people saw some terrifying things up there. And that's also what Soviet intelligence thought. In Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, British UFO researcher. It was close to Admiral Norton, Admiral Lord Hill Norton, British Navy, was one of the people who endorsed his Timothy Good's work.
Mm-hmm.
And in his book, Above Top Secret, Timothy Good recounts a meeting between British intelligence and Soviet intelligence back during the Cold War. And the Soviets said, we were listening to the medical channel during Apollo. They had a channel that they would use to report back like medical emergencies, things they didn't want the public to hear. A separate channel from the one that was being broadcast across television. And, unsurprisingly, the KGB had found access to this.
They weren't supposed to have access.
Even our ham radio operators were listening to this in America. Some ham radio operators said that they were able to pick up on this too. So the Soviets said, we heard Armstrong and Apollo 11 say, these babies are huge. They're huge. They're warning us off. They're on the edge of the crater. And there's this whole conversation on the medical channel about how the Apollo 11 astronauts were effectively assaulted and scared off by huge spacecraft on the moon, which were not there to greet them. They got the sense that they were there to say, get the hell out of here. So, people have all these...
Who was the person that said this? And this was somebody...
It was a conversation between a British intelligence officer. You can find it in Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret.
Above Top Secret, okay.
Yeah, and it was a British intelligence operative who toward the end of the Cold War, was meeting with a Soviet counterpart.
Okay.
And the Soviets said, we have the record of this conversation between Armstrong and ground control on the medical channel, where they were saying they saw the... Now, that would scare the shit out of you.
Yeah.
Moreover, by 69, 70, they had already done this MK Ultra stuff.
Yes.
Right?
So you think they wiped their memory somehow?
Yes, exactly. We had already done this MK Ultra stuff. And I think these poor guys were MK Ultra'd when they came back to try to get them to forget as much of what happened on the moon as possible. And that would also explain why they all wound up with dysfunctional lives. These guys all became alcoholics.
Right.
Their wives divorced them all. Their personal lives became a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's another piece of corroboration that, the moon is inhabited. And it's also probably an artificial satellite.
And why haven't we been back since?
Exactly.
There was we watched this interview multiple times on previous podcasts where there is, I think it's the head of NASA is being he's being interviewed in front of the Senate. And they're talking about China, how they had a plan to map or explore the dark side of the moon or whatever. And they asked him, like, if we plan on doing it too. And he goes, no, we're not interested in doing that. We have no interest in the dark side of the moon.
You know what I find profoundly disturbing about that is that humiliation is the worst thing in Chinese culture. The worst thing, okay? So the Chinese are not about to go up to the moon and have their asses handed to them. Moreover, the Chinese are going to the moon in collaboration and cooperation with the Russians. The Chinese and the Russians plan to build a space station that orbits the moon and then send astronauts from the space station down to the surface of the moon, right? If there's that degree of cooperation between Russia and China on the moon, it means the Soviet dossier has been handed over to the Chinese.
And Soviet dossier?
Yeah, the Soviet dossier on the moon.
Oh.
Okay?
Okay.
What's in that?
Right.
Everything the Americans encountered on the moon, which is why the Soviets never went to the moon. Remember, we were competing with the Soviet Union to go to the moon.
Yeah.
Why is it that we went up there and then all the Soviets just decided to cancel their moon program? No.
They knew.
Of course they knew. They knew. And also there were discussions in the Soviet Union at that time that, okay, if America makes it to the moon first, we'll go to Mars first. They figured it out. Neither are for the taking, neither the moon nor Mars. So what's really disturbing about the Chinese initiative is that if the Chinese of all people are planning to go up there and, I don't know, if not colonize, at least do some scientific research or whatever, right? It means they've gotten clearance.
From the people that are there?
That's right. That's right. Now, and notice how the balance of power is shifting in the world toward China.
Is it really?
It is. Now,
People have different opinions online. I don't know who to believe.
Look, I mean, it has been. Now, whether that can be reversed is another question. But if you wanted to manage a global totalitarian state,
Yes.
with ubiquitous surveillance and an extremely technocratic form of government, with little personal freedom, right? A control society on a global scale, the Chinese would be the optimal people to put in charge for that.
Yeah.
Because it fits the values of Confucianism.
Yes.
Okay? So if someone on the moon, potentially also on Mars, wants to impose a totalitarian world government on Earth, they're not going to make a deal with the United States. They're going to make a deal with China. That's what I find most disturbing about Chinese plans to go to the moon. I actually don't think we would even be going back there if it weren't for the fact that Chinese already are.
Yeah. But, okay, maybe. But who would they make the deal with in the United States? That's the thing. There's two parts of the United States. There's the idealistic view of the United States, and then there's the real people who are running the show behind the scenes in the United States. And they probably are very envious of China's totalitarian surveillance state that they live under. So,
I'm not sure. It's very easy to make these kinds of moral judgments. If I were in Lockheed at a high level with security clearance to the special programs that are dealing with zero-point energy and electrogravitic drives, I'm not so sure that, considering the kind of society we have in this country, let alone in the world at large, I would publicly disclose that technology. I mean, we talked about this last time, I think. The weaponization implications and dual use potential of such technology is extremely socially destabilizing. So the thing is, with China, you can manage technology and control information in that way.
yes, totally.
Based on the ideals of the Bill of Rights and the United States Constitution, you can't.
It makes it way harder.
Right. So they have a good negotiating partner in China.
Oh, yes. That makes a ton of sense. It does.
So even if you're in Lockheed, you're stuck behind all these walls of classification and these security oaths that you've taken, you might still believe in the ideals of the Bill of Rights. And you might not be ready to sell out, at least the American citizenry, to a foreign power or an alien power that intends to subjugate the planet and, subject us to a global tyranny. So, yeah, I'm not convinced that even people in the deepest strata of the deep state are so, how can I put it, callous and nihilistic and self-serving that they would make a deal with people who want tyranny over to the planet. In fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised if for a long time they've kept these technologies close to the chest in order to develop some kind of a deterrence capability or to approach parity, technological and military parity.
With what? With them?
With the people on the moon. And, I've discussed simulation theory and Closer Encounters and other books of mine before, but I discovered something recently that's much more rigorous from a mathematics and physics perspective, and consequently also more compelling and disturbing. And that's this. Okay, so bear with me. It gets a little bit complicated. So we start building computers in the 1940s, right? Alan Turing, the big wall-sized computers, and we're competing with the Nazis. And,
the Maniac and the Iliac.
Yeah, and ENIAC.
Yeah.
And at that time in the 1940s, when we're building the first computers, there was this guy, Claude Shannon, who developed a science known as information theory, subsequently came to be known as information theory. Because before computers were built, nobody thought of mathematically formalizing the transfer of information. We had phones at that time. We had radio transmissions, but nobody thought about what was being transmitted over phone lines or over telegraph lines as data transfer. That concept didn't exist. But once they started building computers, it stands to reason that somebody would mathematically formalize what data is and what it means to transmit and transfer data. So this guy, Claude Shannon, does this. And he comes up with the idea of a binary digit, bit, where data is conceived of according to the binary of 1 and 0. Data as being a construct built from out of sequences of ones and zeros. Claude Shannon is the first person to conceptualize this. And Shannon also makes the point that, look, we live in a universe bound by the two laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is that energy can never be created or destroyed. Energy E equals mc squared. This is going to be important for what I'm about to say. So as Einstein, showed us, energy and mass are interconvertible. E equals mc squared. So energy can become mass and mass can become energy.
Right.
But we can't identify anywhere in the physical universe energy being created or destroyed. That's the first law of thermodynamics.
Okay.
Net total energy remains the same.
Yep.
Okay. So then the second law of thermodynamics is that we notice everywhere in nature, even, like when you pour like a dye into a glass of water, that there's a tendency toward disorder in the cosmos over time. And so the second law of thermodynamics is that in a closed system, the level of disorder or entropy either remains constant or increases. It's never the case that entropy decreases in nature. You never have more order emerge over time in large-scale physical processes.
As things age.
Right. More disorder.
Yes,
This happens to our bodies. It happens to the whole universe.
Okay.
And so this is where they postulate the so-called heat death of the universe, that at a certain point, the entropy will become so great that first, galaxies are pulled apart, then solar systems are pulled apart, then planets are pulled apart, and eventually atomic structures are pulled apart. And life becomes non-viable in the universe. Heat death of the universe. Victory of entropy. That's the second law of thermodynamics. So Shannon says, look, if bits, binary digits, meaning information, is flowing through a computer system, that computer system is in the physical world, meaning it's bound by the laws of entropy. Okay? So then there's this German Jewish physicist, Rolf Landauer. He came over with the other German Jews who were fleeing the Nazis. And in 1961, Rolf Landauer builds upon Claude Shannon's groundwork in information theory. And he comes up with this equation, which I have in Satanian. He comes up with this very short, elegant equation extrapolated from out of the second law of thermodynamics, which says that if you delete one bit of information, there should be an increase of entropy outside of a computer system. So think about it this way. On a microchip or a magnetic tape, when it's blank, you've got the equivalent of 00000 or 1111111. There's no data.
Right.
When you record data on it, you get 0100111011. So actually, the blank tape has more order than when you start encoding information on it, when conceived in physical terms. So because information is meaningful to us, and like a file has a book on it, text on it, and the text has meaning to us, or a photographic image has a meaning content to us, we think of information as, let's say, decreasing entropy, because we think of it as highly ordered because it's meaningful to us. But when you think of it as a bunch of ones and zeros, sequences of ones and zeros, when you think of it inside of a physical system, the blank magnetic tape or the blank microchip has more order in it than when you start to record ones and zeros on it.
Right.
That's more chaotic.
Yes.
00111100. So Rolf Landauer was saying, if we erase the data, we're increasing, if we erase the data, we're decreasing entropy inside the computer. Now, according to the laws of thermodynamics, if you decrease entropy somewhere inside a closed system, meaning the universe, you have to pay for it with an increase of entropy outside outside the computer. So you're decreasing entropy inside the computer
by deleting shit.
Okay. that's got to result in more entropy outside the computer.
Okay.
Because the net energy has to remain the same.
Okay.
So he came up with an equation that expresses this, where if you delete one bit of information, certain amount of energy is released.
Got it.
Okay, now here's where it's going to get weird and creepy. Okay, but that was all necessary background. So we think that information is this abstract thing. We think it's like not physical, right? It's in the realm of ideas.
Yeah.
But what this equation is saying is the following: that if you amass enough data, like on these huge server farms that we have in Silicon Valley, that we have in China, right?
Yeah.
And you're amassing not bytes or megabytes, not terabytes, petabytes, whatever, right? Of data, and you erase all that data, you're going to have to give off a shit ton of energy. That's what Landauer's equation is saying, is that if you erase a large amount of data, terabytes of data, there's a significant measurable energy release that's going to take place. Now, according to E equals mc squared, right? The interconvertibility of matter and energy, what does that mean, conversely? It means that if energy comes out of the computer when the data is released, terabytes and terabytes on some server, right?
Yeah.
What was it when it was inside the computer? Mass. It was mass. So it's been proposed that we could weigh a hard drive before data is encoded on it, and then again after data is encoded on it. Or take a hard drive that has data encoded on it, weigh it, erase the data, and then weigh it again.
Right.
There will be a mass differential.
Okay.
So there's mass inside a computer that's not anything to do with the microchips or the transistors or magnetic tapes or anything. It's a hidden mass.
This has been done, this weighing?
No, here's why. Because currently, according to Landauer's equation, if you were to calculate the mass of all of the information in the world today, on all of the largest server farms that we have in here, and that AI is being run off of in China, the total mass, according to that equation, comes to 1 kilogram, less than 1 kilogram, less than 1 kilogram. Meaning that we don't have sensitive enough weighing equipment to weigh a hard drive, let alone even a server, right? I mean, we couldn't even weigh a server, let alone a hard drive, because the mass currently is too little. However, the rate of data increase per year, the rate at which we're accumulating information per year is approximately 25%, okay? And if you think about where we're going technologically, we're headed toward this technological singularity where we're going to have artificial intelligence inside of robots like the Tesla robots.
Yeah.
We're going to have these systems constantly accumulating all kinds of data, right? And so it stands to reason that as we approach the technological singularity, the rate of data increase per year is going to exponentially take off way beyond 25%, maybe close to 100%.
Okay.
But get this, even if it were to stay 25%, which it won't, but even if it were, I did the calculations. They're in my book, Satanion. In something like 340 years, the amount of information that will exist in the world at current rate of data production will equal the mass of the moon. Now, go back to our conversation about the moon. The moon was brought here to terraform the planet, potentially. In other words, the moon has massive gravitational effects on the Earth.
Yes.
Massive. It took us from having 8-hour days to having 24-hour days. It controls the ocean tides.
Yeah.
It's responsible for the tilt of the Earth's axis. The moon has tremendous gravitational pull on the Earth, and the moon only weighs 1.23% of the mass of the Earth. It weighs only, which by the way...
And what's the size? What's the size comparison from the moon to the Earth?
I don't have the number.
Can you find it, Steve?
Yeah. So
1.23%
mass of the Earth. Okay, so get this. I did the calculations, and something like, I think it was like 340 years from now, something like that, we're going to wind up with a mass equivalent
The moon is 1/4 the size of the Earth in diameter.
Yeah. So isn't that weird also, by the way, that
Find the mass. See if ChatGPT will give you the mass. Or
no,
whatever this is.
you would need to the percentage of the mass of the Earth.
Oh yeah, right. The moon is approximately 27% the size of the Earth in diameter, volume
1.23. It
has a volume of about 2%, right?
1.2. 1.23 is the specific number. Anyway, so listen, I did these calculations, Danny, and
so it says to illustrate, if the Earth were hollow, it would take 50 minutes to fill it, but it's less than 2% the volume.
Yeah, which by the way doesn't make sense in and of itself in terms of
the moon would have to be hollow.
There you go. Anyway, I did these calculations.
Yes.
Something like 340 years from now.
Okay.
There's going to be a moon's worth of mass in the data centers on the Earth.
So the Earth is going to weigh about a moon more than it weighs now.
It'll start to tear apart the planet.
How?
Imagine if you were to take the moon. Look, the moon is at a certain distance from us, right? It's pretty far.
Yeah.
And from that distance, it's having this massive gravitational effect on us. Imagine you took the moon's mass and you distributed it to Silicon Valley, to the major data centers of China. You put that mass right on the surface of the Earth. It will start generating tidal forces toward that gravity well. It will start attracting objects toward the gravity well. Okay, I realize it sounds bizarre, but metal chairs and knives and forks will start to go towards servers. The servers will become a gravity well. There will be so much mass inside them that it's as if the moon is on the surface of the Earth. It gets worse.
So all the data on Earth right now, if you could combine
less than 1 kilogram.
Less than a kilogram.
But because the exponential rate of data increase is so high,
right,
25% per year right now.
300-something years.
In 300-something years, we're going to wind up with a moon's mass worth of data on the Earth. And what's worse is that like 20 years after that, I think it was 20 years exactly after that, we wind up with an Earth's worth of mass on the Earth. It will go from weighing equal to the moon to weighing equal to the Earth itself, which means at that point the planet will be completely torn apart.
Unless we can find another way to store data. Or
yes.
Like off the Earth maybe, or
Sure.
Or maybe we like tap into, some sort of consciousness and we store everything there.
You could build supermassive structures out of like nanomaterials and whatever potentially to do something like this.
Yeah.
But here's where I want to go somewhere else with this. Where I want to go with this is in simulation theory, right? So think a little bit about this. Like, all right, you accumulate this much data, and this is what it would do to the Earth, right? And if you weigh a hard drive before you record data on it, it weighs less than after you record data on it.
Okay.
But we can't see this mass. I mean, you open up. Suppose you're one of these very technically adept computer geeks, and you take the you take the screwdriver to your computer opener. Where the fuck is the mass? You can't see it.
Right.
Even in these giant servers, 340 years from now, once there's a moon's worth of mass in terms of information on the Earth,
right,
you can't see it inside the servers. Is there any other example of mass that we can't see in the universe? Yeah, it's called dark matter. So yeah, this is in my book, Satanian. And the chapter is called Catastrophic Information because there's a physicist recently who's looked at all of this, and he conceptualizes this as an information catastrophe. Melvin Vopson, he's working at a university in Britain, I believe. He's, I think, Romanian originally, but he's working in UK. And he calls it the information catastrophe because, look, at a certain point, we're going to reach a critical mass of data, which will have geophysically catastrophic effects. Oh, here's the other thing. So I investigated what would be the geophysical effects of reaching a critical mass of data. Guess what? It turns out to be every single catastrophe that's been held responsible for the destruction of Atlantis. So all these, you have all these theorists from like Plato, all the way back Plato, to Senator Ignatius Donnelly in the 1800s with his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, to Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. All these people talking about the various
Don't
catastrophes.
forget Flint Dibble.
The various catastrophes that might have destroyed the civilization. And by the way, just on a quick side note, you cannot argue with 1,300-ton megaliths in Baalbek, Lebanon, which are fitted together with razor precision, and you can't even slip a razor blade between the joints. You cannot argue with that, okay? Or those, exactly. The Egyptians had those too, and who knows who they got them from.
Right.
And with what tools they were made.
Perfectly symmetrical.
Yeah.
Had to be made on a computer.
Yeah, so this civilization existed, okay? And there are all these geophysical catastrophes that have been postulated as the cause for the destruction of this worldwide, highly advanced technical culture, right? Guess what? If you wind up with a moon's mass worth of data at Silicon Valley or in China, you know what winds up happening? Every single thing that anyone's ever held responsible for the destruction of Atlantis. Number one, the crust sinks underneath the data center. Number two, it creates a tidal force like the moon does, so the oceans get pulled in toward the data center. Crust sinks, there's a massive flood. It causes earthquakes because it activates the gravitational pull from the servers, activates all the tectonic plates, so you wind up also with massive earthquakes. The same gravitational pull sets off volcanoes, so you get volcanoes going off all over the planet. Potentially, the gravitational disturbance would also even tilt the axis of the Earth, which is something that many people from Charles Hapgood onward have postulated was responsible for the destruction of Atlantis. That potentially Atlantis was Antarctica, that's one theory, and that it was suddenly pulled into the South Polar region due to a crustal slippage.
Yeah.
Well, that's also something that would happen. So I mapped out what would be the geophysical implications of such a critical mass of data. And it's every single thing that anyone's ever thought destroyed Atlantis. Not one or the other of them, all of them at once. So then you got to wonder, what actually destroyed that civilization? Could it be...
Hard drives.
It sounds funny, man, but, it stands to reason. If we're headed for an information catastrophe, what if it crept up on them without them realizing what they were doing? And that's what actually destroyed that civilization.
Oh my God. I had this guy on here from the NSA, Tom Drake, and he was explaining that they have... do you remember, Steve, what he said? He said they have like acres and acres out in the desert somewhere. I want to say like in Nevada or in Wyoming. It was somewhere in the Midwest where they have just like farms after farms after farms of these massive hard drives that are collecting all of the surveillance data that they're using.
Yes.
From satellites, from phones, from literally every single potential way the NSA can collect data on people.
Is it Utah?
Is it? Yeah, Utah. That's it. The Utah data center, known as the Bumbleheve location. The facility spans 1 million square feet and includes 100,000 square feet tier 3 mission critical data center, designed to store vast amounts of data estimated to be on the order of exabytes or larger to support comprehensive national security initiative. The data center uses the Cray XC30 supercomputer capable of scaling workloads of more than 100 petaflops or 100 trillion calculations each second. Look at the picture. Can you pull up a photo of it, like on images?
I'm on Brave right here. Oh, we can absolutely not.
Oh, that's terrible.
Here, I'll get it for you.
Crazy.
Yeah, they're not going to want to, have detailed photography of that site available. I bet you if you Google image search that, you'd be one of these places that's blocked out.
Is that it?
That's it, under construction.
Yeah.
It was only recently constructed, I think.
That's another thing, is that...
So this crust is going to sink under that one day.
Right.
If this theory is correct.
Or it's going to become a magnetic anomaly and throw off the spin of the Earth somehow.
That's right. So there'd be early warning signs. Compasses would start malfunctioning in the vicinity of it.
This is so crazy, man.
So how did we get here? You asked me what would be the effect of knowing the deepest, darkest secrets on somebody, let's say in the NSA, who has that level of clearance, somebody inside Lockheed who has that level of clearance, right? Even IBM. IBM's done a lot of dark shit. IBM made the punch card computer equipment that allowed the Nazis to process Jews through the concentration camps.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
well, I mean, there's a lot of companies that were still around today that did a lot of dark shit with the Nazis, right?
oh yeah.
But those people are all dead, and like the company's still alive.
Sure. The question is the idea dead? And that really speaks to what you asked me. Look, it's one thing, what does it do to your worldview to know that there are people living in underground cities on Mars, or to know that the moon is an artificial satellite?
Right, and you're one of like a dozen people on Earth who have this information.
Yeah, but it's another thing if what you know is that we're living in a simulation. And not only are we living in a simulation, we're living in a simulation with a computational ceiling, meaning that it's inbuilt that we cannot exceed a certain level of data production. You understand? That's a cap on our civilization. It means that, remember people talk about the Kardashev scale. You ever heard about the Kardashev scale?
No.
Michio Kaku used to talk about it a lot. Not that I want to reference Michio Kaku because his con artistry promoting, string theory really damaged the physics community for decades. But Michio Kaku is somebody who...
He wasn't the only one.
He brought back this idea of the Kardashev scale.
Yeah.
It's this Russian scientist who basically came up with this scale of the level of civilization, type 1, type 2, type 3, based on their amount of energy usage.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But the thing about the Kardashev scale is that, okay, one metric is energy usage, but another is the level of data production, right? So we're living in a simulacrum that doesn't allow anyone to even become a type 2 Kardashev civilization. Which, by the way, would explain why the skeptics always say, where are all the aliens? How come there are no aliens here?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Fermi paradox.
Yeah, they never, when they keep citing the Fermi paradox, they like to turn a blind eye to the UFO phenomenon. But even if you consider all the data of the UFO phenomenon, there's actually no really hard evidence that anyone's coming here from outside our solar system.
Right.
There isn't.
Right.
And these entities, at least the ones who seem to be in charge, look human.
Yes.
And the little grays, those are humanoid robots.
That's what
in all
Stephen
likelihood.
Greer said.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of Mike Masters. You've read his books.
Of course. Of course.
That's the best. That is the best, most comprehensive explanation as to why these things are.
My problem with Mike Masters is that he adheres to the block universe idea of the way time is, closed time-like curves. He thinks it's not possible to change history when you time travel. Whereas I've made extensive argument.
Timelines.
Yes, and that would mean
multiverse.
Yes, according to how Mike Masters understands the dynamics of time travel, we would not have any free will. We would be living in a universe where the future is already determined. Anyway, that's a metaphysical argument for us philosophers.
Sure, but generally the idea coming from an anthropological background is that for a being to come from another star system or another Goldilocks planet to have 2 arms, 2 legs, upright hominid, brain on top of the eyes, it would have to be the exact same conditions that Earth is under, with the atmosphere, with everything like that. And it would be like, as to how rare we are on Earth, we're like 0.0001% of the species on Earth that look the way we do, and we're able to develop technology to get off the Earth. So you extrapolate that into the universe, it's like virtually impossible to have another being that looks so similar to us.
I find that a useful argument because I actually do think that we're dealing with descendants of the human race and other versions of the human race in this phenomenon. Staatssicherheitsdienst, National Security Agency. It's a Nazi term. It's a Nazi term. It was imported into this country. National Security Act of 1947 established the National Security Agency, the CIA, and basically the entire infrastructure of our deep state.
That's also when we changed the name of the Department of War to the Department of Defense.
Yeah. Very cute. So get this.
And we created the CIA.
Yeah. So a lot of people talk about Paperclip. We brought thousands of
Yep.
Nazi scientists over here. And people talk only about the physicists for some reason, the rocket scientists, which we'll come to them and the bizarre shit that was going on with them. But there were also psychologists we brought here. We brought biologists here. We brought all kinds of people. The psychologists who developed MK Ultra eventually, starting with Project Bluebird in the 50s, and became MK Ultra in the 60s. Bluebird was worse. They were experimenting on children. These were Nazi psychologists who were brought over here to develop these behavioral sciences. They had been doing these things in the concentration camps. So we bring all these thousands of Nazi scientists over here between 1945 and 1947, okay? You know what else is happening at the same time that nobody seems to talk about? You read the Spanish newspapers at the time, and they're saying bizarre shit that Otto Skorzeny, you know who he was?
Remind me.
So Mussolini, so Italy fell before Germany, right?
Right.
Most of Italy, except for the Salo Republic, which was in the north. And Mussolini was arrested and he was taken, made prisoner on the island of Ponza. The Nazis used psychics, remote viewers, to find Mussolini. They pinpointed him. By the way, the Nazis used to use this to track naval fleets all the time. They would find the positions of destroyers and, American naval ships using remote viewers. Anyway, they used this to find Mussolini, the island he was held on, and they sent this super commando, special forces leader, Otto Skorzeny, guy with a mustache and a real badass fencing scar.
Find a photo of him.
Yeah, a creepy looking guy.
Yeah.
Otto Skorzeny. They sent him to retrieve Mussolini. So there's these pictures where Mussolini has been freed. He's been extracted by the Nazis, and he's with Skorzeny and Hitler. He's been brought back to Reich headquarters, right? They took care of their boy. They found Mussolini, pulled him out. Yeah, look at some of the ones with a... Yeah,
Look at that giant fencing scar.
Yeah, now let me tell you a little bit about this guy. So look, all these people were prosecuted in Nuremberg, right?
Yep.
Somehow this guy gets loose, and he's in Spain from 1945 to 1947 under Franco. So remember, there was one fascist regime that survived the end of World War II. Italy and Germany fell, but Spain survived. Spain was a fascist regime that survived the end of World War II, and moreover, as the mother country of the Spanish-speaking world, the fascist regime of General Franco was connected to the fascist regime of Argentina. And there was a pipeline between Spain and Argentina in terms of Nazi personnel and assets.
Right.
So this guy shows up, the Spanish newspapers are writing, between 45 and 47, and he's with Franco on the Mediterranean coast of Spain, and they're launching saucer-shaped rockets. So they didn't know what to call these things at that point. They only knew what rockets were. Saucer-shaped rockets toward America. What happens in 1947? Roswell. Where is Roswell? The only military base at that time housing nuclear weapons. The base from which the Enola Gay flew to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
Okay? So here's something really disturbing about Roswell.
Corso's descriptions.
Exactly. Corso's descriptions don't fit anything from an alien craft, man. The guy was in charge, as he had a foreign technology division of understanding foreign countries' technologies, right?
Right.
And what did he say was pulled out of the wreckage and then reverse engineered? Velcro, night vision. What else? Was the other one? Kevlar. Come on, man. Aliens coming here from another star system are using Velcro and Kevlar and night vision. That's their state-of-the-art technology.
Nobody talks about this stuff.
There's a reason why nobody talks about it, Danny. There's a reason why nobody...
How did Corso describe this stuff, and where's it documented for people to read it?
Day after Roswell.
It's in Day After Roswell.
Yeah. And he says Kevlar, night vision. Now, Joseph Farrell wrote a great study of Roswell and other associated incidents in the context of Nazi psychological operations. It's called Saucers, Swastikas, and Psyops. By the way, I have big problems with... By the way, don't think I'm you're trying to promote Joseph or something. I spent a couple days with the guy. I got big problems with him. He's an Orthodox Christian, high up in the Orthodox Christian apparatus and so forth. So, Joseph Farrell's worldview at a deep level and mine couldn't be more opposed, right? But I have to say he's done some very rigorous research. And the stuff that Farrell...
Swastikas, saucers.
And PSYOPs. Scorzani's on the cover of that book, actually. Yeah.
Wow.
And so Farrell is commenting on Corso and what Corso wrote in Day After Roswell. And he's saying, there's no way this is alien. There's no way this is alien. Nazi technology was anywhere between 5 to 10 years in advance of ours. We know that. We know that looking at the history of technological innovation, for example, in computers, the Nazis had very small transistors already in World War II. It took us another 5 to 10 years to develop those. IBM had a German subsidiary called Dehomag. It was the German branch of IBM. The information was so compartmentalized. The German IBM was ahead of American IBM, the parent company, and they had transistors that were much smaller, right? So you can look across all the different fields of technology and see, like, for example, the Germans testing night vision goggles in the African desert in 1942. They were like 5 to 10 years ahead of us.
Yeah.
Then when you look at the saucer technology itself, electrogravitics and the saucer airframe.
Who were the brothers that were working on this stuff?
The
A.
Horton
Jacobson
brothers.
Horton brothers.
Yeah. Okay, so when you read the Twining Memorandum, General Nathan Twining's memorandum about the saucers, about flying discs, as they called them in those days, there was a fake version of that was modified and it was leaked in the UFO community, like, I don't know, a couple decades ago. And it changed a few sentences to make it out like Twining thought these were aliens. The original Twining memorandum has since been excavated. And where you read, at the end, when he's drawing his conclusions and making recommendations, he says, basically, this looks a lot like Nazi shit, and we really should find out where the Horton brothers are. Okay? So...
Annie Jacobson talks about this a lot in her Area 51 book.
Yeah.
And I've asked a lot of people about it, and no one seems to buy into it. But I know you're familiar with it. Basically, the idea is that there was...
The evidence is very good.
Mengele surgically altered some children to go in that thing, and
progeria children.
Was remote controlled here.
Progeria children. Their heads get all swollen up, and they look old, even though they're neotenous looking, but they look old at the same time. Their heads get all swollen.
And there was an EG&G engineer who told Annie this, and she goes, why wouldn't you guys make this public if you found out that this was Russian, Stalin flown or Nazi stuff? Like, it would make them look terrible on the world stage. And he said the reason we didn't let it out is because
we continued the research.
We continued the research.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So where is this all coming? The point of departure was our conversation about the deep state. And if there's an entity, as Greer says, and here I agree with him, that's more powerful than all the governments of the world. How did it start? Where did it start? It started here. And it started here because, now, all right, here gets a little bit mind-boggling again. On the one hand, we've imported these thousands of Nazis, and we're engaging them in, let's just say, highly ethically dubious projects, which requires what? It requires a massive state security and classification apparatus to be put in place, right? Which is unconstitutional, according to our Constitution. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. There was that thing, the Bill of Rights, right? So on the one hand, we're bringing all this technical expertise, and the projects they're working on were things they were doing in concentration camps. So we need classification for that. On the other hand, this saucer crashes, and it looks weird. We don't know what it is. Maybe it's alien. We don't know what. But it's definitely a threat to national security. And moreover, the thing crashed next to our only nuclear base at the time. And it's got maybe some deformed children in it. And it's got all this super advanced technology, but still stuff we can understand that we were already working on. So you also need security classification for that. So here we have the National Security Act of 1947, which effectively creates the deep state, right? But let me, all right, I'll finish this point, and then I'll go back to talking about the saucer as an as an engineering design
Okay.
and where it came from. This deep state was already so autonomous from the civilian government of the United States, including our Defense Department, that when von Braun's team was working on the early rockets, the adaptation of the V-2 into a ballistic missile in the 1950s in Texas, the Pentagon officials found out that the Germans were taking classified information to the border and meeting with Nazi officials coming from Argentina and Chile and Paraguay, meeting them in border towns in Mexico, right on the Texas border, and giving them classified information from inside of our programs. So they confronted the German scientists about this, right? They were going to chastise them, whatever. I don't know. What could they do? Right. Revoke their clearances? Well, who's going to build this shit, right? But, they get on their case about it. Guess what the next thing that happens is? Oops, the Germans misdirected their missiles and they landed in Mexico. They shot some ballistic missiles into Mexico. As a way to say to the Pentagon, don't fuck with us. You fuck with us again, we'll start a war with Mexico. So already by the 1950s, they had their hands on the balls of the U.S. government to that extent. This is why you have Eisenhower coming out and making that statement as he leaves office, warning about the military-industrial complex that's gotten out of hand and they're a threat to our democratic society, etc. Because he knew this stuff. And I'm convinced the main reason, now Kennedy made a lot of enemies for a lot of reasons. The Kennedy brothers did, because they were, engaged in prosecuting the mafia and, there was the whole Cuban angle with the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
Yep.
But I'm convinced that the main reason that JFK was killed is that Eisenhower handed this information off to him.
The UFO stuff.
The whole deep state problem.
Yeah.
And said to him, listen, man, you have to get this under control because these people pose an existential risk to our Constitution and our way of life. And Kennedy was going to shut them down. And even after he was executed, his brother would have pursued the same policy. So they were both taken out. And I've heard RFK on record in interviews say that he believes that his father was killed by a Lockheed contractor, specifically a Lockheed contractor. Now, why would a Lockheed contractor assassinate Robert Kennedy? There's only one explanation you can come up with for that.
Whoa.
Now, this is the place to go back to the saucers.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Lockheed Martin used to be called Martin Aircraft.
Yeah.
In 1953, there were all these stories that came out in mainstream news publications about how these aerospace, they were called aircraft companies in those days. These aircraft companies have developed the G engine, and they're about to roll off the assembly line, craft that can defy gravity and get you from New York to Australia in an hour. There were all these stories about this stuff. And they quoted the chairman of Martin Aircraft, Lear, Convair, bunch of companies, handful of companies. And the only one of those that's still active in the defense industrial scene is Martin Aircraft, which became Lockheed. Okay?
Okay.
And then by 1955 or so, the story disappears. The story disappears. And it's at the same time, between 53 and 55, where these chairmen of these aeronautical engineering companies are making these statements, that you have physicists holding conferences about cracking gravity.
Right.
Okay?
Yep.
So the United States cracked gravity circa 1955.
Right.
Townsend Brown was also developing,
Brown,
this polarization effect.
Bryce DeWitt, Lewis Whitten.
Yes, and
or Ed Whitten.
The other company that has some of this tech is Northrop, which designed the B-2 bomber.
Right.
Which some people say the B-2 is a reference to the Brown-Byfield effect.
Right.
That can basically augment the propulsion of an aircraft by lowering the effect of gravity on the aircraft.
Yeah, with ion wind.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so by 1955, they figured this shit out.
And then it went black.
Now, let me ask you something. If we're looking at Kevlar, Velcro, night vision, lasers, transistors, And we see that in all these areas, Nazi Germany was about a decade ahead of us. And we cracked electrogravitics in 1955. When did they crack it? There are reports that, okay, so there was a think tank in Prague under the direction of General Hans Kammler. It was a Nazi scientific working group. And I think it was based in Prague because they were collaborating with the Italians on this. The Italians were a junior partner, and they wanted a country that was sort of nominally not Germany, right? Basically under Nazi control. And there are people who claim that Otto Skorzeny, remember Otto Skorzeny?
Yeah.
He came to the facility in Prague in 1944, toward the war's end. And he saw that the scientists working under General Kammler had developed a circular disc-shaped airframe that was tremendously aerodynamic in its performance. And it had a number of interesting features to it. One is it had these vents that suction the boundary layer. It's called suctioning the boundary layer, where,
Right.
you know, air resistance develops around the edges of any airframe, like an airplane or
Yep.
anything that has sharp edges to it. And so first of all, by making a saucer-shaped craft, you're already reducing air resistance. Then they had suction vents that would suck in the boundary layer and redirect that airflow into the propulsion system. They also developed a kind of metal that was perforated. They called it Luftschwamm, flying foam. And it was a special kind of metal that had lots of tiny holes in it. They would also allow air to pass through. It was a very light metal, which further reduced air resistance. The same think tank, the Kammler staff in Prague, was working on this 9 to 12 foot tall acorn-shaped or bell-shaped
Oh, yes.
reactor. It was
The
a
Nazi bell.
Yes, it was a mercury-thorium reactor whose purpose was to generate more energy than is put into it. It was constantly powered by AC energy with big cables and intermittently shocked with direct current. And it would counter-rotate drums filled with mercury and thorium isotope inside of the shell of this device. And what they realized in the Kammlerstab was we could take this thing and put it inside the saucer. Originally, the saucers were powered by rotating jets. And so we could take this magnificently aerodynamic airframe and take this reactor and put it inside it as a power source. And there's your electrogravitic saucer. Invented in Nazi Germany, 1944-45. We cracked the same engineering problems and propulsion issues in 1955. So what does that tell you about all the rest of the stuff that was discovered in Roswell? It fits the pattern of the Nazis cracking this a decade earlier than we were there, scientifically and technologically. And by the time we were there in 55, this deep state, run by Nazis, already had its hand around the balls of the civilian government of the United States and had already set up the national security state to sequester this information. If you believe the empirical case that's been made for Atlantis in Antarctica, which Graham Hancock made in Fingerprints of the Gods, his first book, working off of the research of Charles Hapgood and Rand Flemeth. And Colin Wilson also at one point found this theory compelling when he wrote one of his books on Atlantis, that the only landmass that fits Plato's description is Antarctica. Plato describes an island the size of Libya and Asia combined, of Asia and Libya combined. In the Greek world, in that time, in Plato's time, that was a description for a territory roughly the size of the First Persian Empire. The First Persian Empire is about the size of the continental United States, a little larger than that. Well, that's the size of Antarctica. Moreover, Plato said that Atlantis was in the world ocean. Well, what does that mean, the world ocean? He said it was outside the Pillars of Hercules, which means the Strait of Gibraltar, but he didn't say it was in what's now the Atlantic. You know, people get this asked backwards. The Atlantic is named after Atlantis. It's named after Atlas, not the other way around. It's not like Atlantis had to be in the Atlantic because the Atlantic. So people named, in other words, the Atlantic because they imagined Atlantis had been there. Okay, named after the Titan Atlas.
Right.
So, but what Plato says is outside the Pillars of Hercules, outside the Strait of Gibraltar, in the world ocean. Well, what's the world ocean? There is one. There's a world ocean. It's where the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean all meet in a single body of water in the shoreline of Antarctica.
How would they get into a war with Athens all the way down there?
They had conquered and were controlling the entire planet. So the Greeks think they're all so important. Like Atlantis came here and fucked with us. Now, Atlantis fucked with everybody. Okay, it was a global civilization. It's a civilization that used those 1,300-ton stones at Baalbek. A global technical civilization. So, first of all, the only landmass that fits the size is Antarctica. Second, it's in the right place. It's in the world ocean. Third, Plato said that when you go to Atlantis, you can come from one side of the world, like South Africa, and cross over Atlantis and you're on the other side of the world. Where else fits that bill than Antarctica?
Right.
Where you go across Antarctica and you can go from South Africa to South America.
Yeah.
Okay? Moreover, if you look at the research of Charles Hapgood, who was actually he was a historian, but he started to develop interesting geophysical theories, and he worked on contract for the CIA for a while. He was a history professor, but he had classified clearances and he worked with the CIA. And he developed this theory of Earth crustal slippage, that when you look at the flash frozen mammoths in Siberia, who are frozen with the food undigested in their stomachs,
Yes.
and certain other things, it looks like the crust of the Earth slipped by several thousand miles suddenly. And this is why we have stories from various tribes who say that the stars fell.
Like the idea of this is called, what is it? It's called like a geomagnetic pole flip or something like that.
Earth crustal slippage is this technical term for this particular theory. Earth crustal slippage, Charles Hapgood. And if that theory is correct, and that's how the mammoths were flash frozen in Siberia, and the food that we found undigested, frozen in their stomachs, is food of a temperate climate. Okay? So it means that Siberia used to have a temperate climate. It was suddenly pulled toward the polar region, the North Polar region.
Where the Earth's outer shell can move as a whole over the mantle, like the skin of an orange.
Yes. It happens because it happens because during ice ages, the Earth gets top heavy from all the ice that's weighing down the crust.
Right.
And so it causes it slip at a certain point. And the fact that the food in the mammoth stomachs is food from a temperate climate means that Siberia was suddenly pulled into the northern polar region. If you look at Antarctica, right?
Yeah.
And you look at how Siberia slipped, it means as Siberia slipped suddenly into the northern polar region, Antarctica slipped suddenly by several thousand miles into the southern polar region. So about 2/3 of Antarctica would have been where Argentina is today.
Right.
Argentina is a great place.
Right.
Great agriculture, great wine, great livestock, right? Atlantis would have been very habitable if Atlantis were Antarctica before the crustal slippage. So Hess, what did Hess know?
Also, to linger on Atlantis for a minute. According to this long chain of transmission with Solon and all this stuff, Atlantis would have been how long ago again?
Okay, I mean, Plato's dates line up with a lot of other evidence that points to about 10,500 BC or 12,000 years ago.
12,000 years ago. Yeah. And this is also when people hypothesize the Younger Dryas cosmic impact theory would have happened too, which a lot of people think that the mammoth being frozen was from a cosmic impact that basically blacked out the sky. And
that's an alternative hypothesis. In any case, Antarctica fits Plato's description of Atlantis best. And so if you were to ask me, what did Hess, on the Nazis in general, find in Antarctica? They found Atlantis. And they were obsessed with Atlantis. The entire Nazi elite, which came from out of the occult Vril Society and the Thule Gesellschaft. The Thule is a German equivalent of Atlantis. Ultima Thule. It's a landmass at the north of the world, a vast landmass at the north of the world. Now, we don't have any landmass at the north of the world. But what is the north of the world? The magnetic poles shift like every, I forget what it is, 23,000 years or something like that.
No, it's slipping like literally. What is it? We talked about it on that Jimmy Corsetti podcast.
It's migrating right now.
It's migrating like miles per year.
Which means a reversal is about to happen again. Okay? So when the Germanic people preserved this ancient myth that there was this Ultima Thule, a huge continent at the north of the world, it's probably dating from a time when the poles were reversed. Antarctica was the northern polar, region, and vice versa, magnetically. So the Nazis were obsessed with finding Thule or Atlantis.
Yeah.
And they may have hit jackpot circa 1938.
But then wouldn't there be some sort of evidence of it if the Nazis were there back then? Like, wouldn't some of the stuff, would they find pyramids? What did they find there?
Well, there's evidence the Nazis were there. I mean, look up Operation High Jump.
Right.
1946, Admiral Byrd went down there with a whole fleet. And they were supposed to be on an expedition that lasted months. And they ran into something that devastated the fleet. And they retreated very quickly. And on his way back to, United States, they stopped at some port in Chile, I think. And Byrd made this bizarre statement about how we have to prepare in the next World War to encounter aircraft that can cross from pole to pole with amazing speed. And so it looks like they went down there maybe because they knew the Nazis were down there, tried to clear them out or something, and they had the shit beaten out of them. 46.
What do you make of the argument that Plato was full of shit and he wasn't a historian? He was just making up hypothetical allegories, like the allegory of the cave. What was Atlantis? Just another philosophical allegory like the cave?
Okay, let me answer in two ways.
Okay.
My first answer is that it could be that Plato never existed. We can completely disregard Plato. The evidence for Atlantis is overwhelming. Don't call it Atlantis. By the way, I'm pretty sure the Atlanteans didn't call it Atlantis. They probably had some other name for it, right? So,
other than Plato, what is the most compelling evidence?
There's so much compelling evidence. I mean, first of all, the megalithic structures that have inexplicable engineering skill behind them.
In Egypt?
On every continent. It's everywhere. Look at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, the Calasasia at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, some of the older sites in Mexico, in the Yucatan. All of these sites exhibit the same enigmatic Sacsayhuaman is another one, Ollantaytambo. The walls at Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo are made of insanely gigantic megalithic blocks which intersect with the blocks next to them, sometimes at 12 different points of intersection.
Yeah.
Which means that either they had a way to liquefy stone and mold it as they were putting stones together, or something even more mind-boggling, the stones were all pre-cut like jigsaw puzzle pieces and then put in exactly the right place. Well, either of those are insane from an engineering perspective. I mean, even we won't do that. We won't. Maybe we can just barely now, but no one in our world would ever think to try to do something like that. And by the way, that type of building, it turns out, it's extremely earthquake resistant.
Yes, it is.
Because it wobbles and then locks back into place.
Yeah. Also, the ground that it was built on, something about it, the way they built the foundations of it, the stone is like super flexible and malleable.
Yeah, and some of these blocks, like the ones at Baalbek, 1,200 ton stones, 19 cranes can't lift those things. 19 industrial cranes. Who did that?
Yeah.
All right, so look.
I mean, it's
written in stone.
Whether you want to call it Atlantis, like I agree.
Who cares what you call it?
I agree that's evidence of a super advanced civilization that was here before we have any kind of explanation for it.
By the way, other cultures have other names for it. Not all cultures call it Atlantis. You find this in almost every civilization in the world, that there's a myth about a super civilization that existed in antiquity, and that the people who lived there were demigods, that they were godlike people.
Yeah.
Who then disseminated knowledge to other primitive cultures in the world. You find it, this basic myth in the Mayans, you find it in the Egyptians, you find it in the Middle East, in Iranian civilization, which is something I'm very familiar with. I wrote a whole tome on the history of Iran.
Yeah.
In ancient Iranian culture, they called this place Aryanam Vaeje, which means the seed cradle of the Aryans, meaning where the Aryan race came from. That's what they say.
Right.
And they say it was a place, this is a very interesting detail. So you have all these flood myths around the world.
Right.
And the flood myths are connected to the myth of the destruction of the super civilization in all
Right.
these cultures, including
Yeah.
Mayan culture,
Right.
Egyptian culture. The one exception is Iran, where Iran, we talked about this first interview. Iran, the name means Aryan. It's a Middle Persian form
Yes.
of the ancient Persian Aryan or
Yep.
Aryana. The Iranian ancient mythology is the only one that says the super civilization wasn't destroyed by a flood. It says our homeland froze. Our homeland was an island at the center of the world. It was the central continent of the world, which is what Antarctica looks like. If you make a
During the Ice
globe.
Age, it would have been massive.
Yeah,
right?
you make a globe
Yeah.
centered on Antarctica. You take a globe and you flip it so you're looking right at Antarctica. It looks like the continent at the center of the world. If you live there and you're mapping the world from your perspective.
Right.
So they say it was a continent at the center of the world, and all of a sudden it froze over.
See if you can find a graphic depiction of what Antarctica would have looked like during the Ice Age, the last Ice Age.
You're talking about the subglacial topography of Antarctica.
Yes. That would be the technical way of putting it.
Yeah. So, no, that's what you want to look at. Look up subglacial topography, Antarctica. They have found maps, like the Orontius Phineas map and the Piri Reis map,
right.
which show Antarctica underneath the ice. No one in recorded history ought to have been able to map that landmass subglacially.
Look how big that shit is.
Yeah. Well, it's larger than the continental United States.
That's insane.
Antarctica-
And that on the left, that connects down to South America.
The amount of the closest point to any land is in Argentina. You think that's a coincidence? Do you think it's a coincidence when the Nazis went to Argentina, that where they went was San Carlos de Bariloche? That's Patagonia. It's the southernmost point of Argentina that's close to Antarctica. Very convenient.